Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. This is the Fast Friday edition of the show for April 23rd, 2021. And on this episode, I've got an interesting lesson back from the Articles of Confederation that can help us understand nullification strategy for today. I'm going to cover taxes, requisitions of the states, fiat money, printing and devaluing a currency, and I've even got James Madison and Alexander Hamilton up in the mix. But first of all, before getting to that, my name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. Our show homepage has everything you need to follow this program. It's 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to Liberty, all spelled out. There you're going to find all the archives of the show. On individual episodes, I include a bunch of links and references so you can read and learn more on your own time. We've got all the different platforms. We live stream on some video ones, and we've got archive only on other video platforms, and then we're on all kinds of audio only podcast platforms. You can also find our membership program where you can put your financial faith behind our work for as little as $2 a month, and we make it go a long, long way in support of the Constitution and liberty. Again, that show homepage is 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. And I couldn't be more grateful for you spending some of your time with me today. Thank you so much for being here. Whether this is your first episode or you've been here for every single one since day one, I can't thank you enough. But since it's Fast Friday, I promise not to take up too much of your time. Let's see if I can get this info out to you in the next 10 to 15 minutes. We'll see. And the reason I thought of this episode is I was going through some old articles on the site, and I came across this one by Mike Meharry, a nullification lesson from the Articles of Confederation. And here's how he sets the stage. He says, under the Articles of Confederation, the Congress could not compel the payment of taxes. It could only requisition the states and hope they paid up. But in many cases, they didn't. This caused significant funding problems during the American Revolution and was one of the main factors driving the ratification of a new constitution, empowering the general government to levy taxes. Mike goes further. He says, in order to fund the war effort, the Continental Congress issued paper money. Haven't we heard that kind of a story all through history and even today? As the Congress, he writes, put more and more of the currency in circulation, you might be surprised, or hopefully you're not, it rapidly depreciated in value, making it increasingly difficult for the Continental Army to purchase supplies. And here from Wikipedia as well, this is an interesting overview. This part of the page says another problem was that the British successfully waged economic warfare by counterfeiting the Continentals on a large scale. Here's how Benjamin Franklin put it. He said, the artists they employed performed so well that immense quantities of these counterfeits, which issued from the British government in New York, were circulated among the inhabitants of all the states before the fraud was detected. This operated significantly in depreciating the whole mass. We understand, of course, all of us here understand the more they print, the less value it has. So when they just can throw out this fiat money, and this is actually an interesting war tactic that the British used back then that Franklin recognized and so many others. And here you can see, if you're watching the video rather than listening to the audio, and I will link to this so you can pull it up if you'd like to, a $55 Continental note from 1779. And you might be familiar with the phrase that this all led to. That is, not worth a Continental. Murray Rothbard put it this way. He said, the Continental Congress, and this was a paper, it's over at Mises.org, but I think it was published originally back in 1950. The Continental Congress and the state governments tried every coercive means available to prevent the persistent trend of rising prices. Stringent price control laws were passed, and other laws compelled creditors and merchants to accept Continentals on par with specie. So goes the story that under the Articles of Confederation, it was the land of the free. But anyways, Rothbard goes on. In 1775, the Continental Congress resolved, quote, that if any person shall hereafter be so lost to all virtue in regard for his country as to refuse to accept the Continentals, such person shall be deemed an enemy of his country. And Rothbard says, but to no avail. And we know here from a letter that was written by William Fleming to Thomas Jefferson in May of 1779, he said, there are between 130 and 140 millions of dollars now in circulation. And Congress, this was their bold attempt to do something about it, that's the phrase he used, to make one bold effort to restore its sinking credit, yesterday passed an act to call on the states for their respective quotas of $45 million by the first day of next January. So this was May 22nd, 1779. So they passed an act on the 21st saying, okay, we've got to get this loot. Back to Meharry, he points out that in September, and I think it wasn't even published maybe widely until November, but in September of that same year, John Jay was the president of the Continental Congress at that time. He sent out a circular letter pleading for the states to make good on the requisition. And here's how Jay put it. It has already been observed that in order to prevent the further natural depreciation of our bills, we have resolved to stop the press and to call upon you for supplies by loans and taxes. You are in a capacity to afford them and are bound by the strongest ties to it. Meharry says he went on to write that the remittance was, quote, the price of liberty, the peace, and the safety of yourselves and posterity. So he's really, really urging everyone to chip in, but it's a requisition. And historian Walter Starr summed up, and this was a book that was published, I think, in 2012, summed up the impact of the circular letter in his book on John Jay. And this is how Starr put it. But the letter, for all its eloquence, did nothing to stem the continued depreciation of the continental dollar. Within a little more than a year, the rate between the hard dollar and the continental had reached 1 to 100. That's the phrase, not worth a continental. And Mike says, with nothing binding the states to pay their full share of the requisition, they didn't. And as I mentioned earlier, this was part of the drive for a new constitution. This was part of the many problems that people saw as happening under the Articles. And here from James Madison in a letter to George Washington, this is less than 6 weeks before the Philadelphia Convention. It's April of 1787. And he's outlining what he thinks is the right approach for the new central government or the new national government. And that's how he put it. He said the national government should be armed with positive and complete authority in all cases which require uniformity, such as the regulation of trade, including the right of taxing both exports and imports. He wanted to make sure that they could actually get involved in this taxation thing. Madison goes on, he says, over and above this positive power, a negative in all cases whatsoever. And I think Madison actually highlighted that or underlined it in his original letter. He says, a negative in all cases whatsoever on the legislative acts of the states, as heretofore exercised by the kingly prerogative, appears to me to be absolutely necessary and to be the least impossible encroachment on the state jurisdictions. I don't know how that's a low encroachment, but he thought it was absolutely necessary to have a national veto. He says, without this defensive power, every positive power that can be given on paper will be evaded and defeated. And this is basically Madison's thought process living through what went down under the Articles of Confederation and the requisition of money from Congress to the states. And if the states could just evade it, then they were going to defeat any federal program. Back to Meharry, he points out that Alexander Hamilton specifically, much more so than Madison in that letter to Washington, specifically used this experience as a central argument for ratification of the Constitution in Federalist Paper number 16. He called the system of voluntary participation by states as, quote, the parent of anarchy. And this is how Hamilton put it. It has been seen that delinquencies in the members of the Union are its natural and necessary offspring, and that whenever they happen, the only constitutional remedy is force, and the immediate effect of the use of it, civil war. Of course, he's warning that if the central government or the new general government doesn't have this power, that it's going to be war and destruction and nothing else. Back to Meharry, he says, Hamilton then cites objections to state legislatures playing a role in bringing federal measures to effect. He's complaining about any notion that you would rely on the states to implement a federal program. And Mike says, in so doing, he unwittingly lays the foundation of state nullification. And this is how Hamilton put it. If the interposition of the state legislatures be necessary to give effect to a measure of the Union, they have only not to act or to act evasively, and the measure is defeated. Think about that. Hamilton was onto something. He lived through it. Madison recognized this. And then Madison, when he changed his tune in Federalist 46, promoted this exact same thing that he was concerned about, thought was absolutely necessary in his letter to Washington. He did change his tune and said, like, this is a selling point. The states can refuse to cooperate with officers of the Union. And when enough adjoining states take this approach, it would create an environment the federal government would be hardly willing to encounter. I'm probably butchering that paraphrase, but it's the same message that Hamilton was talking about. Now, Madison in Federalist 46 was looking at it or selling it as a positive to the people of New York. Here, Hamilton was complaining about it. But either way, they both recognize that when the federal government has to rely on states to implement a federal program, all they have to do is not act or act evasively, and the measure is defeated. That's what Meharry says. This is exactly what happened in 1779. The states weren't required to act, and they didn't. Their inaction thwarted the will of the central authority, and states find themselves in this exact same situation today. Because the federal government is so large, it's not anywhere close to what was originally set up under the Constitution. In fact, it's the largest government in the history of the world. And because of that, it requires states to implement most federal programs. But here's the dirty little secret. Partnerships don't work too well when half the team quits. And here's how Mike put it. From prosecuting the drug war to enforcing federal gun control, the federal government needs state resources and state personnel to enforce its laws and implement its programs. By simply doing nothing, states have the power to stop federal actions dead in their tracks. And he says this is how he sums it up. Basically, the lesson from the Articles of Confederation is that when states didn't have to participate, they didn't. They still don't have to participate under the legal doctrine that we're aware of called anti-commandeering. And then, of course, Mike says, and they shouldn't. And the one episode that I want to point you guys to, in case you haven't checked it out yet, is an episode I did back in February of 2019, Anti-commandeering, the legal basis for refusing to cooperate. This starts with James Madison's advice in Federalist 46, a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union. That's his advice for individual cities and states. And then, of course, I go through the 5 main Supreme Court opinions from 1842 to 2018, where the Supreme Court backed up Madison's strategy as the anti-commandeering doctrine. Well, I hope you guys found this interesting. It was educational. I hope you learned something. I hope you enjoyed watching or listening to it. I really, really appreciate you spending some of your time with me today. If you support the show and you want to help us spread the word, make sure to smash that like button, leave a review on Apple Podcasts or any other podcast platform, subscribe, get notifications, comments, especially in the archive. All that helps trigger the algorithm of the mainstream platforms primarily, and it tells them to show the program to more people. And of course, if you want to put your financial faith behind our work, it starts out as little as $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Again, I really appreciate you spending some of your time with me today. I hope you have a great weekend, and I'll see you next week here on the Path to Liberty.